The air in the Quartermain living room was so thick with tension it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the handful of guests gathered for what was supposed to be a joyous union. Instead, the atmosphere was closer to a wake. Willow Tate stood before the makeshift altar, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a bouquet of white roses that seemed to mock the pallor of her skin. She looked not at the man standing opposite her, but at the floor, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. Drew Kane, by contrast, was the picture of confident benevolence. He stood tall in his charcoal suit, a reassuring smile plastered on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. He reached out, gently covering Willow's cold hands with his own, a gesture meant to comfort, but which only made her flinch inwardly. This wedding wasn't about love, not really. It was a fortress, a legal barricade. Spousal privilege, Drew had insisted. Unity in the face of the Da. If they were married, they were a united front against the charges threatening to rip her away from her children. Willow. Drew's voice was soft, soliciting the attention of the room. You okay? She looked up, meeting his gaze. Behind the concern, she saw the steel trap of his manipulation, though she couldn't quite name it yet. I'm fine, she whispered, the lie tasting like ash. Just nervous. In the back of the room, Michael Corinthos watched with a jaw set so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, but he was paralyzed by the terrifying possibility that this sham marriage was the only thing keeping Willow out of prison. Next to him, Brooklyn Quartermain gripped his arm, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. You can't do this, Brooklyn hissed under her breath, her eyes darting between the couple and the door. Where the hell is Chase? He said he had a lead, Michael muttered, his voice raw. But we're out of time. Across town, the sirens of a PCPD cruiser wailed like a banshee, cutting through the heavy afternoon traffic. Harrison Chase gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckle intensity, the tires screeching as he took a corner onto wheels. On the passenger seat beside him lay a manila folder thin, unassuming, but containing a bomb that would blow Port Charles wide open. Come on, Chase urged the engine, pushing the pedal to the floor. Every second that ticked by was a second closer to Willow making a mistake that could ruin her life. He had spent the last 48 hours running on caffeine and adrenaline, chasing down a ghost of a digital trail that the forensic tech had almost missed. But he had found it. The unedited security footage, the deleted emails, the smoking gun. Back at the mansion, the efficient cleared his throat, an uncomfortable sound in the silent room. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Drew Kane and Willow Tate. Willow felt the room spin. The faces of her family, Michael's anguish, Brooklyn's panic, the confused innocence of the children blurred into a watercolor of despair. She was doing this for them. She had to believe that. Drew is the only one who can save me. She repeated the mantra, though her guts screamed otherwise. Do you, Drew, take Willow to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Drew said, his voice smooth, resonant, dripping with a sincerity that chilled Michael to the bone. And do you, Willow? The officiant turned to her. The silence stretched, agonizing and long. Willow opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked at Drew, who nodded encouragingly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, a silent warning. Do it, Willow began, her voice cracking. The heavy oak doors of the Quartermain mansion burst open with a crash that shook the walls. Stop! The shout was a thunderclap. Every head turned. Harrison Chase stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his uniform disheveled, the manila folder held high like a weapon. Chase, Willow breathed, her knees nearly buckling with a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. This wedding is over, Chase declared, striding into the room, his eyes locked on Drew. There isn't going to be a wedding. Not now, not ever. Drew stepped forward, his benevolent mask slipping to reveal a flash of irritation. Detective Chase, this is a private ceremony. You have no jurisdiction to interrupt. I have every jurisdiction when I'm holding evidence of a felony. Chase cut him off, his voice ringing with authority. He didn't stop until he was standing between Willow and Drew, creating a physical barrier. He turned to Willow, his expression softening instantly. "Willow, you don't have to do this. You're innocent. We can prove it. Right now." "What are you talking about?" Willow asked, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch Chase's arm, grounding herself. "The shooting," Chase said, turning to address the room, but keeping his eyes on Drew. "The evidence that was found in your car? It was planted. And we know who did it. This is ridiculous." Drew scoffed, though a bead of sweat had appeared at his temple. "Michael has been trying to frame me for months. If you have evidence, it's just more of his fabrications." "It's not from Michael," Chase said coldly. He opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs and a printed transcript. "It's from the cloud server you thought you wiped, Drew." A collective gasp went through the room. Michael stepped forward, his eyes wide. "What?" Chase held up a photo. It was grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Drew handing a thick envelope to a man in a dark hoodie, the same man identified as the shooter. "This is a time-stamped security image from the pier, 2 days before the shooting," Chase explained, his voice steady and lethal. "And this," he waved the transcript, "is the recovery of the deleted text thread between Drew and the gunman. He didn't just hire him to shoot him. He gave him specific instructions on how to make it look like Michael did it." Willow stared at the photo, her world tilting on its axis. The man she was about to marry, the man who had held her hand and promised to protect her from the charges, was the architect of her nightmare. "You," Willow whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She turned to Drew, horror dawning in her eyes. "You set this up? You had yourself shot? You planted the gun in my car?" "Willow, listen to me," Drew said, his voice rising in panic, his hands reaching for her. "He's lying. Chase is working with Michael. They're trying to separate us. Don't you touch her," Michael roared, lunging forward, but Brooklyn held him back, her own eyes filled with tears of shock. "The metadata doesn't lie, Drew," Chase said, stepping closer, his presence commanding. "We have the bank transfer. We have the confession from the shooter. We picked him up an hour ago at the bus station. He gave you up for a plea deal. He admitted you told him to plant the evidence on Willow if the Michael frame-up didn't stick." The silence that followed was absolute. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and grotesque. Drew's face went pale, the confident facade crumbling into something ugly and desperate. "I did it for us," Drew shouted, the veneer finally cracking completely. He looked at Willow, his eyes wild. "I had to. You were drifting away. You were going back to him." He spat the word at Michael. "I needed you to see that I was the only one who could save you. I needed you to need me." Willow recoiled as if he had struck her. "You tried to send me to prison," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You let me believe I would lose my children. You terrified me. Just to own me. I love you," Drew insisted, but the words sounded like a curse. "That isn't love," Chase said quietly, his voice cutting through Drew's hysteria. "That's control." Chase turned to Willow. "You're free, Willow. The DA is dropping all charges. The warrant is being issued for Drew as we speak." Willow looked at the man in front of her, Chase, with his honest eyes and his fierce determination. He had come for her. He hadn't given up. In the midst of the chaos, a clarity washed over her. She looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, a symbol of her entrapment, and tore it off. She threw it at Drew's feet. "Get out," she said, her voice low but steel hard. "Get out before I kill you myself." Drew looked around the room. He saw Michael's murderous rage, Brooklyn's disgust, and the cold, professional judgment in Chase's stance. He realized, finally, that he had lost. With a sneer that twisted his handsome features into something unrecognizable, he turned and stormed out the door, the sound of his footsteps fading into the impending wail of approaching sirens. The tension in the room broke like a fever. Michael rushed forward, wrapping Willow in a crushing hug. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry I couldn't stop him sooner. It's over," Willow sobbed into his shoulder, the adrenaline crashing out of her system. "It's finally over." But as she pulled away from Michael, Her eyes sought out the man who had actually saved her. Chase was standing a few feet away, watching them with a mixture of relief and a lingering, painful longing. He looked exhausted, his uniform rumpled. But to Willow, he had never looked more beautiful. She stepped away from Michael and walked toward him. The room seemed to fade away until it was just the two of them. "You saved my life," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I promised I would," Chase said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you didn't do it. I never doubted you for a second." Willow reached out, her hand trembling, and cupped his cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that jumped the gap of all the years and mistakes between them. "Why?" she asked, searching his eyes. "Why did you fight so hard?" Chase covered her hand with his own, pressing it closer to his face. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear, "I couldn't watch you marry a lie. You deserve the truth, Willow. You deserve to be free." Willow looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the depth of the love he had buried for the sake of everyone else's happiness. It was pure and selfless, and it had saved her when she was drowning. "Thank you," she breathed, leaning her forehead against his chest. She felt his heart hammering against her own, a rhythm that matched hers perfectly. From the sidelines, Brooklyn wiped a tear from her cheek, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. She saw the look on Chase's face, the look he had never quite given her, not fully. And Michael, standing beside her, let out a long, shaky breath. He saw it too. The connection between Willow and Chase wasn't just history. It was a living, breathing thing that had just survived a fire. As the police lights flashed through the windows, illuminating the ruins of the wedding that never was, Willow lifted her head. She didn't know exactly what the future held. She didn't know how they would untangle the mess of their lives. But as she stood there, held safe in Chase's arms, she knew one thing for certain. She was free. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Next, the air in the Windermere living room was stagnant, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the lingering acrid smoke of a discharged weapon. Jen Sidwell stood over the sprawling, lifeless body of Henry Dalton, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury. The election results had been the final insult. Laura Collins had retained her mayoral seat, effectively blocking his legitimate avenues for acquiring the waterfront properties he coveted. If he couldn't buy Port Charles, he would break its spirit, starting with its beloved matriarch. "You were becoming a liability, Henry," Sidwell murmured, nudging the professor's limp hand with the toe of his polished Oxford. "And liabilities are liquidated." He turned his gaze to the shadows, where Britt Westburn stood paralyzed, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen it all, the argument, the sudden flash of the gun, the hollow thud of Dalton hitting the floor. Sidwell's eyes bored into hers, dark and predatory. "You saw nothing, Britt," Sidwell said, his voice dropping to a silken whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. "Unless you wish to join him. Or perhaps you'd prefer I pay a visit to your mother." Britt's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the antique console table, her mind racing between the urge to scream and the survival instinct that had kept her alive through horrors past. She nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion, unable to find her voice. "Good," Sidwell said, turning back to his men who had materialized from the hallway. "Clean this up. Plant him in the mayor's car. Let's see how Laura explains a dead body in her trunk to the PCPD." The parking garage beneath the Metro Court was dimly lit, the concrete pillars casting long, ominous shadows. Laura Collins fumbled with her keys, exhausted from a day of press conferences and damage control regarding the election fallout. She popped the trunk of her sedan, intending to toss in her briefcase, but froze. A gasp died in her throat. Staring back at her were the glassy, unseeing eyes of Henry Dalton, his shirt stained crimson. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Laura!" The voice came from the shadows, rough and familiar. Sonny Corinthos stepped into the pool of yellow light, his brow furrowed. He had been leaving a meeting with his lawyer, but the look on Laura's face stopped him dead. "Sonny," she choked out, pointing a shaking finger at the open trunk. Sonny moved past her, looking inside. His expression didn't change, but his jaw set hard. "Sidwell," he muttered, "the name a curse. He's trying to pin this on you. A dead body in the mayor's car? You'd be in handcuffs before sunrise." "I have to call Dante," Laura whispered, reaching for her phone. "I have too." "No." Sonny's hand clamped over her wrist, firm but not aggressive. "Think, Laura. You publicly threatened Dalton yesterday. The election just ended. Sidwell owns half the judges in this town right now. If the cops find this, you go down, and Sidwell wins. Is that what you want?" Laura stared at him, the moral compass that had guided her for decades spinning wildly. She hated that he was right. This was a frame-up, executed with military precision. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying we make this disappear," Sonny said, his eyes dark with resolve. "You and me. Tonight, we handle this, or you lose everything." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. Laura looked at the body, then at Sonny the mob boss she had fought, befriended, and tolerated for years. They were on opposite sides of the law, yet bound by a common enemy. "Okay," she breathed, the word heavy with resignation. "Help me." The drive to the Pine Barrens was silent, the tension inside the car thick enough to choke on. Sonny drove Laura's car, while his security team followed at a discreet distance in an SUV. They worked in the dark, the beam of a single flashlight cutting through the dense woods. "Grab his legs," Sonny instructed, his voice low. Together, the mayor of Port Charles and the godfather of the disorganized crime world hauled the dead weight of Henry Dalton into a shallow ravine, covering him with brush and heavy stones. It was a grim, unholy alliance forged in desperation. As they finished, Laura wiped dirt from her hands, feeling a stain that no soap could wash away. "This never happened," Sonny said, looking her in the eye. "For Rocco's sake. For your family. This stays between us." Laura nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "Sidwell won't stop. Sonny, this is just the beginning." "I know," Sonny replied, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "And when I find him, he's going to wish he'd stayed in whatever hole he crawled out of." The fluorescent lights of the juvenile detention center buzzed with an irritating, high-pitched hum. Rocco Falconeri sat on the edge of his cot, his head in his hands. He was innocent he hadn't touched those labs, but Dalton's testimony had damned him. Now Dalton was dead, though Rocco didn't know it yet. The cell door buzzed open. 3 older inmates stepped in, their expressions sneering and cruel. "Sidwell sends his regards, kid," the leader spat. Rocco stood up, backing against the wall. "I don't know who that is. Leave me alone." "He knows you," the boy laughed, cracking his knuckles. "He says you know too much about the labs. Says you need to learn to keep your mouth shut." The beating was brutal and fast. Rocco curled into a ball, trying to protect his head as kicks rained down on his ribs and back. Pain exploded in his side, his vision blurring. They left him groaning on the concrete floor, a message delivered in blood and bruises. Sonny's fist slammed onto the desk in the visitation room, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Through the glass, he saw Rocco's battered face, one eye swollen shut, a split lip, his arm in a sling. The sight tore at Sonny's heart and replaced it with a block of ice. "Who did this?" Sonny demanded, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Rocco, look at me. Who touched you?" I don't know their names," Rocco mumbled, wincing as he tried to shift in his chair. They said Sidwell sent them. Said I had to keep quiet about the labs." Sonny closed his eyes, inhaling a sharp breath through his nose. Sidwell! Again! He had come for his territory, he had come for Laura, and now he had touched his flesh and blood. The rules of engagement had just changed. This was no longer business. It was extermination. "You're going to be okay," Sonny said, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective growl. "I promise you, Rocco, nobody is ever going to touch you again. I'm going to burn their world down." Leaving the detention center, Sonny pulled out his phone. "Brick, it's me. I need everything on Sidwell's operation inside the juvie system. Guards, inmates, payrolls. I want names, and I want them an hour ago. He crossed the line. Across town, Britt Westburn paced the floor of her hotel room, a glass of scotch in her hand. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Dalton's chest exploding. She saw Sidwell's smirk. She was the only loose end, the only one who could tie Sidwell to the murder. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Remember our agreement. Silence is golden. She hurled the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. She was trapped. If she went to the police, Sidwell would kill her. If she stayed silent, she was an accessory to murder, and a man like Sidwell would eventually clean up his loose ends anyway. Damn it, she hissed, tears stinging her eyes. She thought of Jason, of the life she was trying to rebuild. Was it worth dying for? Or was it time to fight back? At City Hall, Laura sat behind her desk, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. Dante stood before her, his notebook open, his face etched with worry. "Mom, we have a missing persons report for Henry Dalton," Dante said, watching her closely. He was last seen leaving Windermere. His phone pinged near the Metro Court, then went dead. "You were at the Metro Court last night." Laura met her son's gaze, her heart twisting. Lying to Dante was the hardest part. "I was, Dante. I was working late. I didn't see Professor Dalton." "There are rumors." "Mom," Dante pressed gently. "People heard you arguing with him the day before. About Rocco. If something happened." "Nothing happened that I know of," Laura lied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I hope you find him, Dante, for everyone's sake." As Dante left, Laura slumped back in her chair. The pressure was mounting. She couldn't keep this up forever. She needed to go on the offensive. She opened her laptop, pulling up the encrypted files she had started gathering on Sidwell's shell companies. If she couldn't get him for murder without implicating herself, she would get him for everything else. She would tear his empire apart paper by paper. Sonny didn't wait for the sun to set. He drove straight to the warehouse district, to the import office Sidwell used as a front. He didn't bring an army. He didn't need one. He walked past the startled receptionist and kicked open the double doors to the inner sanctum. Sidwell was sitting behind a glass desk, sipping espresso. He didn't look surprised. "Sonny," Sidwell smiled, setting the cup down. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Here to surrender the peers?" Sonny walked until he was inches from the desk, leaning down, his palms flat on the glass. The air between them crackled with violence. "You had my grandson beaten," Sonny said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. "You put a body in Laura's car. You think you're playing a game, Sidwell. You think because I've been quiet, I'm weak." Sidwell chuckled, leaning back. "I think you're a relic, Corinthos, a dinosaur waiting for the meteor. Rocco was just collateral damage, a lesson in silence." Sonny moved faster than Sidwell expected. He reached across the desk, grabbing Sidwell by the lapels of his expensive suit and hauling him forward. Sidwell's guards drew their weapons, but Sonny didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them. He stared straight into Sidwell's soul. "You made a mistake," Sonny whispered. "You made it personal. I don't care about the peers. I don't care about the territory. You touched my family." He shoved Sidwell back into his chair with enough force to rattle the glass. "I'm going to find every hole you hide in," Sonny vowed, straightening his jacket. "I'm going to strip you of every dime, every ally, every safe house. And when you have nothing left, when you're begging for a way out, I'll be there." Sonny turned and walked out, the guards parting like the Red Sea before his fury. Sidwell straightened his tie, his hands shaking slightly for the first time. He had wanted a war. He realized, too late, that he had just declared it on the devil himself. Later that night, Britt stood on the pier, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She pulled her coat tighter, looking at the dark water. She couldn't do this alone. She needed an ally. She pulled a burner phone from her pocket and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "It's me," She said when the line connected, "I need to talk. I know where the body is, and I know who pulled the trigger." The war for Port Charles had begun, and the lines were drawn not in sand, but in blood.